Hello. A cup of tea. What could be more English and benign than a cup of tea? But I'm going to tell you the real history of England, the history of Hengest and Horsa, how the start of England began with betrayal, lust, blood feuds, and the ultimate invasion of Britain by the English. How the English started off as their first mention in history by the Romans from a Roman defeat of the English in the neck of Denmark. How the English thus sailed under Hengist and Horsa to Britain to, with their Frisian allies and their Saxon brothers, to become servants of Vortigern, the overlord of Great Britain after the loss of Roman Britain to the Welsh. The Roman Empire still exerted some influence, much like the United States does today, over its former empire and former client states. It sent troops there to help Vortigern put down rebellions, but the country was still in civil war. The whole story is told in these books by Catherine Herbert, English Heroic Legends, The English Warrior by Stephen Pollington, and The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which all of these books I have read, and I would also recommend Frank Stenton's Anglo-Saxon England and Beresford's Celt and Saxon. What did the English unleash in Britain? Am I pro-English or am I anti-English? Well, I consider myself an Englishman, but I'm also Celtic and Nordic. I'm a mix of the two different races. What strikes me is that the English used Germanic people, who were a different race to the Celts and Nordic people, as soldiers. This group of people, the group of races, the Germanics, came from originally northwestern China, as mummies and archaeological evidence have shown. They migrated continuously west over several thousand years and ultimately led to the arrival of the Huns. This is how the word Hun, which meant man in Old Germanic, came to be used to signify all the peoples east of the Rhine. Because the Germans themselves, or the Deutschlanders, as I should correctly call them, themselves, were originally Celtic and Nordic, and the different mixes of the two, and worked on happily together. For the most part, there was the author Tacitus wrote that there were seldom wars between the different kingdoms under as the Nordic and Celtic people had such petty kings. That the kings themselves were more or less elected and were more like presidents in our modern language. But Hengist and Horsa, although they suffered themselves a strike against their honour, and also because of the rape of Hengist's daughter by Vortigern, a blood feud with the Welsh themselves, the ancient Britons, that is, the post-Roman Britons, the Romanic Britons. The English unleashed their Germanic soldiers on Britain, and this caused a lot of problems throughout the centuries, as I will show you in the further vids on the series. There were certain things about the Germanic people's culture that was at odds with the Nordic and Celtic ways of doing things. Well, the Nordic and Celtic people themselves were quite closely related, and as the historical evidence shows. And they also shared their realms with what they would have called the Welsh, who just simply means foreigner or slave, which included the Romans, the former Roman imperators. The Romans themselves had dominated Europe for over 1,000 years before the eventual technological race between them and the Nordic and Celtic peoples ceased to matter, because the Romans for a long time had the engineering, the running water, there were centrally heated houses in Roman Britain. All of this collapsed because of rapid inflation, and the debasing of their own currency by the successive emperors. Some of this was stopped under Marcus Aurelius and Hadrian and others, but these were the emperors who were living in the middle of the Roman Empire, and its decline had already started from around the time of the birth of Christ, which is a coincidence, by the way. Before I get any end timers talking to me about it, the Romans had successfully defeated. On that point, the Romans had successfully defeated the Jews at the Masada many times over, and throughout their history, the relationship between them. But what they couldn't face was the Nordic people. The Nordic people instead of using slaves, although they did use slaves, and mostly amongst the Germanic people who were their servants, were the use of the 12-horse deep plough, which created furrows that were deep enough to sow crops and thus get a rapid turnover. Thus they had a technological advantage over the Romans. Now, the story of Hengest and Horsa shall be told quickly. Hengist came to Britain as a mercenary, right? And it was mentioned in the Beowulf poem that this was the case. He came into the service of Vortigern, and then at Crayford made camp, and then marched up to a place called Dumfries, which is now in Scotland, which means the fort of the Frisians in Old English. Hengist represented the English mercenary band, but there were many others, and there were many others who had stayed after the service of the Romans in various guises, both for and against Vortigern. But what happened was that Hengist used his daughter to entice Vortigern into this alliance during marriage. But before this could take place, Vortigern is said to have raped Hengist's daughter and then broken his pledge to marry her. This caused Hengist to call over a blood feud and then make a proclamation to all the Nordic and Germanic people of Deutschland to come of England, in Deutschland as it was, the old England at the neck of Denmark, in England as it was called, to come up to Britain and fight the Welsh and Roman Britons. This was done because he said that the Welsh had broken their oath of allegiance to him and burned the settlement at Crayford, which Vortigern had set aside for the English to stay. So then they brought their women, their children and their kings over from the old country to the new country, to Britain, to forge and create a new land called England. They burned and harried the land using ships and horses to penetrate deep inland and harry all of Vortigern's navy throughout the coastal regions. This was done with the aid of over 50,000 troops, but at the Battle of Crayford, both sides used around approximately 7,000 troops. The Hengist called the Welsh cowardly